Hello, welcome back to Jorbs scribbles on the screen and talks about everything in the Slay the Spire compendium. Today I'm talking about Shrug It Off, and I'm joined by Electrobolt tonight. Say hi.
What's up, guys?
Electrobolt's a friend of mine, very good Slay the Spire player, played the game a lot back when Ascension 15 was the highest difficulty, did very well. Hasn't played as much lately, and I thought it would just maybe be interesting to have him on so that he can ask questions and reflect what I'm saying and stuff like that. And it'll just be a conversation instead of me talking to myself. So anyway, today we're talking about Shrug It Off, which gains 8 block and draws 1 card for 1 energy, and the upgrade takes it to 11 block. The general, I think, consensus normal thing to think about Shrug It Off as you play Slay the Spire and rise in the ranks is that it's a very solid block card, and gaining 8 block for 1 energy is pretty okay, and drawing a card while you do it is pretty okay too. But I think Shrug It Off drastically falls off in power as you get closer and closer to Ascension 20, and the reasons for that are, well, there are a few. One big reason for it is that 8 block for 1 energy stops winning at some point. At some point you do have to do more than that, and at Ascension 1, just like spending 3 energy for 24 block is sort of great for almost every fight in the game. But at Ascension 20, when you're killing the heart, that's actually a pretty bad turn. So when you start looking at the other really strong things that Ironclad can do for mitigation, Shrug It Off tends not to fit very well with them. One thing is that ever since Corruption was made into a rare and Dark Embrace was made into an uncommon, it's become much more usual for Corruption decks to have a copy of Dark Embrace as well. So anytime you're using skills to block and you have a Corruption, you're likely going to be able to find a Dark Embrace, at which point the draw 1 card written on Shrug It Off isn't very good. And in fact, early turns for decks like that are all about making sure that you have enough energy to play Corruption and Dark Embrace and your other powers when you draw them. And so often on early turns you actually won't be able to play Shrug It Off, because if you draw Corruption or Dark Embrace with it, you may not have enough energy to actually play them. So the draw 1 card on Shrug can actually become a downside at that point. Another thing is that this card is sort of like slow and ineffectual when it's compared to the very strong strength scaling decks that Ironclad can have. If you get a feed and get up to 120 max HP and you get a Reaper and you can get to 30 strength, this card just is very unexciting. It's not a very impressive card in a deck like that. And so you can block in early turns with things like Anchor or like Incense Burner if you're lucky enough to get a really premium blocking relic. And you can also block with cards like Flame Barrier, which do better if you end up with Corruption and Dark Embrace, and also just give you more ability to channel lots of energy into block on a turn where you need to do that earlier on in the run. So, overall the card's okay. If you need block, you should be taking Shrugs. But I think for the first half of the run, it's actually pretty common that you don't need very much block. And in general, I do not think you should be over-prioritizing this card, even though it is a very solid common. Just don't get carried away. That's my Shrug spiel. Oh, that was only 4 minutes. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm able to, so just for everyone watching, I have not played a lot of A20 Ironclad. So it's interesting because I'm able to extrapolate a lot about the way in which the game changes at A20 from that perspective. And I think it's interesting that the reason that you're framing it that way, specifically with the common card Shrug It Off, is because Shrug It Off is just pretty powerful for a common. In A15, while there was definitely a threshold at which you stop taking Shrug It Off or you stop wanting Shrug It Off, as far as common goes, it was generally one of the cards that you'd be more likely to add late in Act 1 and in Act 2 and in Act 3 still into your deck. So, because, if we were having a conversation about Cleave, we wouldn't be talking about, like, it not being good to take anymore.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. I think, and the point, so I guess my questions for you are, how often would you say you end up with a corruption deck that utilizes what's that card that helps you draw?
Dark Embrace.
Yeah, that it utilizes Dark Embrace. How often do you end up with that?
It's really hard to put a percentage on that right now. The game has changed somewhat recently, and I haven't played like 500 runs in the new game where boss relic trades are good because the boss relic pool is different and stuff like that. Win rates are higher than they used to be. But I would say that in my winning runs, maybe like 50% of them are pivoting heavily on Corruption and Dark Embrace, and there are also even more than that that have Corruption but maybe aren't doing the Dark Embrace thing. They just have it for a different reason.
Right, okay, so that's why I asked, because I felt like I haven't played a lot of A20 Ironclad, but based on the way I think about the game changing in difficulty and the strategies you used, I figured that you probably do end up with a corruption deck a large percentage of the time. So it's interesting, because I honestly, and you can help me understand this, Shrug It Off is one of the cards that I think of that I really want with Corruption, because sometimes the problem you'll run into as Ironclad is you'll have a Corruption and you just won't have enough skills to really utilize the fact that you've put it in play.
I think if you're in that situation, you can recognize it and grab a Shrug there, for sure. But I would say that a card like Flame Barrier is a lot better to pick up to like deal with Act 2 elites, for example, than a Shrug is going to be. Obviously, Flame Barrier is an uncommon, and there aren't really any commons that I'm going to compare Shrug It Off to and say like, hey, Shrug is worse at blocking than this card. Maybe True Grit in some situations, but for the most part, Shrug is a strong common. The general point is just to make sure that people are recognizing that it's a common. There are definitely much better, much more important cards. Might be worth mentioning too that this card isn't that good with Runic Pyramid and isn't that good with Snecko Eye, so your really heavy boss relic hits don't like this card very much.
And I think that's important, even more so for A20 than A15 too, because I found because I played a bunch of A20 Silent, I found that because win rates I felt like were pretty getting the right boss relics had such a high correlation with if you won the run or not, that like building your deck to prepare for the right relic ended up being a good idea. So
that's less and less true now, I think.
Really? Okay.
The boss relic pool has narrowed and gotten stronger, and that makes it easier to win more runs.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
Another way to express that maybe is that like getting your 4th energy from a boss relic happens much more often, and so building a strategy that does well with that gets rewarded more often, even if it doesn't win as often as building like a Snecko Eye strategy and then getting Snecko Eye.
Right.
Obviously that would be the dream, but it only happens one time in 8 or whatever.
So that's a little bit in favor of a card like Shrug It Off, because just cantrips are just generally better if you have more energy.
Yeah, I would say though that Ironclad has a lot of very good 2-cost cards, like Shockwaves and Uppercuts and Immolates and Bash Plus is often in your deck by the time you get to Act 2 even. And so a 1-cost cantrip is not necessarily as good as it seems like it is. You're often just going to want to play Shockwave Uppercut or something. Probably not those 2 cards specifically, but you're often not going to actually have a great way to use 3 energy efficiently. You want to have 4.
So I think it's interesting to think about it in terms of the exceptions to that then, because after playing hundreds of runs, you end up starting to see trends like there's the spot weakness, anger Act 1, and if that's your Act 1, I assume you'd want Shrug a lot more.
Yeah, Shrug definitely sounds better in a deck that has those sorts of cards. Ironclad, I think, likes to trade Boss Relic quite often because of how strong 4 energy is, which I think means that Ironclad spends a whole lot of time on 4 energy in Act 2. Gotcha. Often even in Act 1.
Yeah.
Anger's still strong, but it's not quite as strong as it was before boss relic trades were so common, and strong boss relic pool relics weren't as common.
So totally unrelated question, but this is the first video we've done together, and I'm just curious. Is it fun for you to do that? Because I always suspected that swapping boss relics was, if not always, the correct strategy. I mean, maybe not at 815, but I felt like it was pretty close to being a very good strategy, but I never did it. I just like took that out of the game tree.
Yeah.
Because it was just more fun for me to play with the starting relic.
Yeah, I'm very similar. I always felt like good whale bonuses that weren't boss relic trade were going to be stronger than boss relic trade, but sometimes you don't get very good offers. And I also felt like playing with boss relic trades was very difficult compared to the normal whale bonuses, because like a runic pyramid act 1 is very different from a burning blood act 1. And then like there are astrolabe act 1s where things get really weird because you're starting with 3 weird cards. But in general, I think the truth is that while these are very different conditions to play in, a lot of the time they are way stronger than another whale bonus, would have been. And a lot of the time they're so much stronger than the difficulty the game is offering that even though they're different and unique, they end up not actually challenging you with very interesting decisions. And that's
really funny.
That's often my experience with boss relic trading. And
then there's Are there like still a few very bad hits that just like you like go down to 5% win rate or something?
I don't think anything takes you down to 5%. I think like Busted Crown is quite bad.
Is Tiny House still in the game?
Tiny House is still in the game, but like Tiny House is fine. Burning Blood only heals you for 6 at the end of every combat. It's like, I don't know, it's comparable to a Regal Pillow or something. There are other ways to get sustain, especially Ironclad has Reaper as a rare card that's often like a chase rare that you're building around, so it's not like Ironclad doesn't get sustain any other way.
Gotcha. So you would still say probably though that Tiny House is worse than Burning Blood. It's just not the end of the world.
I don't know that it is.
Really? Okay.
It's in the same on that, I bet. It's in the same echelon as Burning Blood, I will say, but upgrading a card's pretty sweet. Getting a card choice early is pretty sweet. The gold matters, the potion matters.
Yeah, I guess 50 gold on floor 1, especially if there's a shop before the first elite, is actually really relevant.
Yeah, and dying to Act 1 elites is definitely one of the fail conditions in Slay the Spire, and it happens, I think, a lot more with Burning Blood than with Tiny House. Tiny House just gives you a lot of chances to get something that kills an early elite. Yeah,
actually, now that you point that out, I can see that specifically getting those bonuses before the first elite is actually a pretty big deal. Gotcha.
All right, so let's shrug it off.
Let's shrug it off. Swap relics, and if you get Tiny House, it's about comparable to Burning Blood.
Eclectic. I like it. All right, thanks for tuning in.